The men laughed before she even touched the rifle. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not in the debrief, not in the after-action reports, not in the carefully worded emails that got forwarded up the chain of command. They laughed, openly. The kind of laugh that doesn't bother hiding itself because the people doing it don't believe they'll ever have to answer for it. Staff Sergeant Kowalski started it. He was standing at the far end of the firing line, arms crossed, watching the new analyst walk across the gravel toward the long-range position, and he said something to the man next to him. Delaney, a sniper instructor with 11 years and 3 combat deployments, and Delaney looked at her, and smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile at all. Her name was Sloane, Nora Sloane, 29 years old, civilian contractor brought in by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to evaluate a new ballistic modeling system that the Marine Special Operations Command had been testing at Camp Pendleton for the past 6 weeks. She had a master's degree in applied mathematics from MIT, a second one in atmospheric physics from Johns Hopkins, and a publication record in computational fluid dynamics that her supervisor at DARPA had described as, quote, unreasonably good for someone her age. None of that was visible when she walked across the gravel. What was visible was a woman who was 5'4", wore her dark hair pulled back without ceremony, and carried a data tablet instead of a weapon. Kowalski watched her set the tablet down on the field table next to the shooting position, pick up the range card someone had left there, and study it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone solving a problem in their own time. He found that funny too. What Kowalski did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Nora Sloane had been shooting since she was 12 years old. Her father had been a competitive long-range shooter in western Montana, and he'd started teaching her on a .22 at an outdoor range near their house in Bozeman the summer before 7th grade. By the time she left for college, she could hold a sub-MOA group at 800 yards in field conditions, and she'd done it in wind, in rain, in temperatures that made the math genuinely difficult. She'd never competed, she'd never advertised it. She had come to Camp Pendleton to evaluate a ballistic software system, and that was what she intended to do. The system she was there to evaluate was called ARC, Adaptive Range Calculator, and it was designed to replace the manual doping process that military snipers used to calculate firing solutions at extreme distances. The existing method worked. Everyone knew it worked. The snipers at Camp Pendleton had trained on it for years, and most of them were very good. The question DARPA wanted answered was whether ARC could do it better, faster, more accurately, with less margin for human error under stress. The man in charge of the evaluation was Major Dennis Harrow, a square-faced officer with the particular kind of patience that comes not from temperament but from discipline. He had agreed to host the evaluation because he'd been ordered to, and he had communicated that fact, without saying it directly, in every interaction he'd had with Sloane since she arrived on base 3 days earlier. He gave her access to the range. He gave her the data she needed. He did not give her the impression that he expected anything from it. Dr. Sloane, he said it the way you say something you've decided in advance to be polite about. We're ready when you are. She nodded, picked up her tablet, and walked to the shooting position. The range ran to 1,600 meters. The steel targets at the far end were barely visible to the naked eye, small gray rectangles that shimmered slightly in the marine layer coming off the Pacific. It was overclocked in terms of atmospheric complexity. Sea level pressure, high humidity, a variable crosswind coming in from the southwest at somewhere between 8 and 14 miles per hour, shifting every few minutes in a pattern that didn't repeat cleanly. It was the kind of condition that separated good shooters from exceptional ones, and it was the kind of condition that made ballistic modeling extremely hard to do accurately. That was the point. Harrow had designed the evaluation scenario himself. Kowalski was still smiling when Sloane sat down behind the rifle, a precision bolt action chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, the same platform the unit's snipers trained on, and began working through the ARC interface on her tablet. He leaned toward Delaney again. Sloane didn't look up. What she was doing, in the 23 seconds it took her to enter the data, was something the snipers in that unit spent years learning to do manually. She was building a firing solution from scratch, using real-time atmospheric inputs, target distance, bullet weight, muzzle velocity, spin drift, Coriolis deflection, and a wind model that ARC generated by combining the base station's weather data with a predictive algorithm she had helped write 18 months earlier at a Johns Hopkins computing lab. When she hit the calculate button, ARC gave her a precise elevation adjustment and a wind hold in tenths of a mil. She dialed in the elevation. She verified the wind hold on the reticle. She settled into the position the way someone settles into something they've done 10,000 times, without thinking about the settling itself. The shot broke cleanly, 1,600 meters downrange. The still target rang. Delaney stopped smiling. She fired 4 more rounds. All 5 impacted the target within a group that, when Harrow's team measured it afterward, was tighter than anything the unit's own snipers had produced at that distance during the previous month of training. The wind had shifted twice during the string. ARC had predicted both shifts within 1 mile per hour. She had adjusted in real time without breaking her position or her rhythm. Harrow said nothing for a moment. He stood at the spotting scope looking downrange and said nothing. Then he said, "Run it again." She ran it again. Same result, different wind, different target position. The group at 1,600 meters was smaller than the first one. Kowalski had moved away from Delaney by then. He was standing slightly apart, arms no longer crossed, with the particular posture of a man who is recalibrating his understanding of a situation and would prefer not to be watched while he does it. The problem started the following morning. It didn't announce itself as a problem. That was how these things worked. The friction began quietly, in the small acts of institutional resistance that were invisible to anyone not looking for them. Sloane noticed. She'd worked inside enough technical evaluation environments to know what genuine cooperation looked like, and she knew what it looked like when people were complying without cooperating. There was a difference, and it mattered. The data she needed for the second phase of the evaluation required access to the unit's historical shot records. Every training iteration logged over the past 6 months, with atmospheric data attached, so ARC could be validated against a real-world sample of conditions and outcomes. Harrow had signed off on the access. What he had not done was tell the man who controlled the records, Gunnery Sergeant Theo Calloway, to actually provide them. Calloway was 51 years old. He had spent 28 of those years in the Marine Corps, the last 11 at Camp Pendleton, and he knew exactly what it meant when a civilian contractor from a federal research agency came to evaluate a system designed to partially automate what his snipers did. He had opinions about that, and those opinions lived in the 3-day delay he produced every time Sloane made a request. He wasn't obstructing. Nothing he did could be called obstruction. He was processing her requests through the proper channels, which happened to involve a lot of proper channels, and the proper channels took time. On the second day, Sloane sat in the small office they'd given her on the edge of the range complex and worked with what she had. She ran the atmospheric data she'd collected herself against ARC's predictive model and refined 2 parameters in the wind algorithm that she'd suspected were slightly miscalibrated for maritime conditions. She documented everything. She wrote it up in the kind of clear, methodical language that could be read by a mathematician or a gunner without losing meaning for either. On the 3rd day, Calloway produced partial records, half the dates she'd requested, incomplete atmospheric logs, several entries where the key performance variables were missing entirely. He delivered them with the expression of a man who had done exactly what was asked of him. She looked at the records. She looked at him. "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. She went back to her office and worked with the partial data. She was good at working with partial data. Her doctoral research had involved reconstructing fluid dynamic models from incomplete sensor arrays, and the cognitive habit it had built. The ability to extract signal from an incomplete dataset without overfitting or assuming away the gaps served her here the same way it had served her then. She identified what the missing data would likely have shown based on the conditions she had direct atmospheric records for. She documented her methodology so completely that anyone reviewing it could see exactly where inference ended and measurement began. She submitted her Phase 2 report on the 4th day. Harrow read it the same afternoon. Sloane knew he read it because his aide left a voicemail asking her to come to his office at 0800 the following morning. And the voicemail had a tone of someone who had been told to make a call and wasn't entirely sure what would come of it. She was there at 0755. Harrow's office was spare in the way that military offices are spare. Not minimalist, just stripped of everything that wasn't functional. There were awards on the wall, framed and aligned, and a whiteboard with range schedules and personnel assignments written in the careful block print of someone who had been writing on whiteboards for decades. He was standing when she came in, which she noted, and he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Your report," he said, sitting down. "Walk me through the methodology on page 9. She walked him through it. He asked good questions. That surprised her, not because she hadn't expected him to be intelligent, but because the questions he asked were the ones a technically sophisticated reader would ask, the ones that probed the load-bearing assumptions in her inference model, rather than the surface findings. He understood what she'd done. That meant he understood why the partial data hadn't broken the analysis, and it meant he understood something else, that ARC, operating on complete data in real field conditions, had outperformed his unit's manual process by a margin that was not small and not arguable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Who flagged the maritime calibration issue?" he asked. "I did," she said. "It was in the algorithm I helped develop. I knew where to look." Another pause. "How long have you been shooting?" she told him. 17 years. Long range, field conditions, mostly informal, never competitive. He nodded once, the way people nod when a piece of information lands exactly where it was already heading. "That explains the grouping. It explains part of it," she said. "ARC explained most of it." He looked at her for a moment. "I want to be direct with you, Dr. Sloane." She waited. "I had reservations about this evaluation," he said. "I have reservations about any system that proposes to reduce the role of trained human judgment in high-stakes scenarios. I think you understand that." "I do," she said. "My reservations are not gone," he said. "But what you showed me on that range, and what you showed me in this report, is that you are not proposing to eliminate judgment. You're proposing to support it." He set the report down. "That's a different conversation." Sloane said, "Yes, sir. That's the conversation I've been trying to have." What she didn't say, because it wasn't necessary to say it, was that the distinction he was describing was the one she'd spent 3 years trying to articulate to people who kept hearing the first half of it without the second. The system wasn't meant to replace the shooter. It was meant to give the shooter more precise information faster, under conditions where the manual calculation process introduced errors that got people killed. The math didn't care about pride. The math was just the math. She went back to the range that afternoon because Harrow had asked her to run a demonstration for the unit's sniper team. The full team, this time, not just Kowalski and Delaney watching from a distance. She wasn't sure what to expect from it. She'd been in enough rooms where expertise met institutional skepticism to know that the sequence didn't always resolve cleanly, even when the data was clear. 11 men were on the firing line when she arrived. She recognized most of them from the previous days, faces she'd cataloged without trying to, the way she cataloged most things, because her brain filed information in columns, whether she wanted it to or not. Kowalski was there. He was standing toward the end of the line with his arms crossed again, but differently. Not the crossed arms of someone waiting to be amused, but the crossed arms of someone who had already updated and wasn't sure how much to show it. She set up at the primary firing position. She ran ARC through the full setup process, narrating each step at a volume the line could hear, explaining what the system was taking in and what it was calculating and why. She was not performing. She was teaching. There was a difference, and she made it visible in the way she moved through the material. No drama, no emphasis on effect, just the clean transfer of information from one place to another. Then she shot. She ran a 10-round string at varied distances. 800 meters, 1,400 meters, back to 2,600. Changing targets. Resetting the firing solution each time using ARC. Firing within 15 seconds of the final calculation. 8 of the 10 rounds were first-round hits. The 2 that weren't produced immediate corrections from ARC based on the trace data, and the follow-up shots on those targets landed clean. The line was quiet when she finished. Delaney spoke first. He walked to the firing position, looked at her data tablet, looked at the screen, and then said, "Can I try it?" She handed him the tablet. He sat down behind the rifle. She walked him through the ARC interface, not fast, not slow, at the pace he needed. He took 7 minutes to build his first firing solution, which was about 5 minutes longer than he'd need after 20 hours of practice. He fired. The target at 1,500 meters rang. He looked up. Something in his face had shifted, not the look of a man being converted exactly, but the look of a man who had separated the question of what this system was from the question of what he'd assumed it was, and found they weren't the same thing. "Again," he said. She walked him through it again. The problem with Callaway surfaced 3 days later. Harrow had approved the Phase 3 component of the evaluation, which required running ARC against a set of controlled scenarios with live shooters, units, snipers using the system for the first time, assessed on accuracy and decision speed. The scenarios required coordination from range control, which Callaway ran. The first 2 sessions went smoothly, the third one didn't. The atmospheric sensors that fed into ARC's wind model went offline 40 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. Sloane got the alert on her tablet, ran the diagnostic, and identified the problem. 2 of the 3 base station sensors had been switched to offline mode from the range control terminal, not malfunctioned, switched. She sat with that information for a moment. She could escalate immediately, go to Harrow, show him the diagnostic log, let the chain of command handle it. That was the clean path. It was also the path that turned a technical issue into a personnel issue before she'd verified her read of the situation, which she'd been wrong about before and didn't assume she couldn't be wrong about again. She walked to the range control station. Callaway was there. He looked up when she came in with an expression that had been prepared in advance. Neutral, slightly occupied, the expression of a man doing his job. "I'm showing the base station sensors offline," she said. "Aware," he said. "Maintenance window. Should be back up this afternoon. The session is in 40 minutes, she said. "I know when the session is," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said the thing that was actually being discussed. She went back to her office. She spent 32 minutes rebuilding the wind model, using the single remaining sensor, archived data from the previous 6 days, and a statistical approach to estimating current conditions that produced wider confidence intervals than the full 3-sensor array, but was better than nothing. She documented every assumption. She tested the model against the archived data and found it predicted historical conditions to within 1 mile per hour 68% of the time, which was not ARC's normal performance margin but was usable. She ran test session on the degraded model. 3 snipers, 6 scenarios each, all of them using ARC for the first time. The hit rates were lower than they would have been with full sensor data. She noted that explicitly in her log, but ARC's performance still exceeded the baseline manual calculation rate from the unit's own historical records on comparable conditions. She submitted a formal incident report to Harrow's office that afternoon. She described what she'd found in the diagnostic log. She included the timestamps. She did not characterize Callaway's intent. She described what the data showed and what she had done in response. Harrow read it within the hour. By the end of the following morning, Callaway had been reassigned to administrative duties for the duration of the evaluation, and range control had been handed to Sergeant First Class Okafor, a younger man who'd been on the range line for the first demonstration, and who, Sloane had noticed, had been the one standing next to Delaney when Delaney said, "Again." The final phase took 4 days. It involved 12 scenarios across a range of distances, atmospheric conditions, and target configurations, with 4 different shooters rotating through the primary firing position. Sloane ran ARC and collected data. She did not shoot in the evaluation scenarios. That wasn't her role, and she didn't make it her role. She was there to evaluate the system, not to prove a point. The point had been made. On the last day, Harrow came to the range in the late afternoon, after the session had finished and the shooters had cleared off. The light was flattening out over the hills to the east, and the marine layer was pushing back in from the coast, softening the edges of the range complex. He walked to where Sloane was sitting, entering final notes into her tablet. He stood for a moment, looking out toward the target line. "When I read your initial brief," he said, I assumed this was about automation, budget reduction, something coming for the billets. I know, she said. I was wrong about that. You weren't entirely wrong, she said. The system does reduce some manual workload. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't, but the scenarios where it performs best are the ones where the shooter is working alone, at distance, under time pressure, without a spotter. That's where the manual process fails at the margins. Those are the situations where people die because the wind call was 3 miles per hour off. Harrow was quiet for a moment. One of my men died that way, he said, 2 years ago. Forward fire base, Eastern Afghanistan. Long-range interdiction scenario, shot didn't go where the calculations said it would go. The follow-up time cost them the window. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. That's not the only reason I ran the evaluation cleanly, he said, but it's part of it. She looked out at the range. The steel targets were almost invisible in the late afternoon light, pale rectangles barely distinguishable from the hillside behind them. At 1,600 meters, you had to know where to look. Your report goes to the acquisition committee next month, he said. I'll be submitting a command endorsement. She nodded. I'll also be recommending a second evaluation, he said, extended. More units, more conditions, longer baseline period. He paused. I'd like you to run it. She looked at him. I'm a contractor, she said. DARPA has to approve the scope. I know how contracts work, he said. He almost smiled. I'm asking if you'd be willing. She thought about the wind algorithm and the 2 parameters she'd refined during the delay that Callaway had manufactured, and the fact that the refined version had performed better in maritime conditions than the original design had. Not because the delay had helped her, but because having nothing to do except think had given her the space to find something she'd been walking past for 18 months. She thought about Delaney saying, again. She thought about the 11 men on the firing line and the difference between the way they'd looked at her on the first morning and the way they'd looked at her on the last. Yes, she said, I'd be willing. The marine layer had come all the way in by then, diffusing the last of the afternoon light into something gray and even, washing the hard edges off the range complex. Somewhere down the line, a range flag snapped in the wind from the southwest. 8 miles per hour, steady, the kind of clean, readable condition that shooters and mathematicians both prefer, because clean, readable conditions tell you the truth. She picked up her tablet and began entering the final notes. The math didn't care what anyone had assumed about her when she walked across that gravel. It never did. It just waited, the way mathematics always waits, to show exactly what was there.